out for latecomers. Good. Well, a very warm welcome, as I say, first of all, from myself, Monica Bohm-Duch, and I do recognise some names in the audience, but others that I don't. So if you'll bear with me, I'll say a little bit about the Insiders Outsiders project and explain how this event fits into the scheme of things. It started off as a small idea that got gratifyingly large, but the original impetus was to pay a kind of nuanced and more critical analytical homage to the tremendous contribution made by refugees from Nazi Europe, and in some cases those who came after, who actually survived the Holocaust, to this country's culture across all art forms. And it took the form of a year-long nationwide in-person festival that I have to say exceeded my wildest expectations. And then COVID hit, and luckily the festival was coming to an end anyway, and the obvious thing was to go online. And as I know some of you do know, it's an ongoing project which Daniel Snowman has been very much part of, whereby we're continue to offer, I think, a rich and diverse and stimulating array of mostly online events, even now in the post-COVID era. But as a kind of natural corollary to that emphasis on what you might call the first generation, those who actually went through all that life threw at them in the 30s and during the war and beyond, it's been of great interest to me to actually look at the artistic and creative responses of the so-called second generation, or indeed the third generation in some cases, those who inherit the stories, if you like, who have to deal with the legacy of what their parents or grandparents had to go through. So it's my very great pleasure tonight to add to that already quite, sort of rich resource that we have on the Insiders Outsiders YouTube channel we've actually called it Second Generation Voices. But to add to that by having Kathy Henderson here in conversation with Daniel Snowman about her wonderful new book with a wonderful title, My Disappearing Uncle, but then with a second title, which is of equal importance, Europe, War and the Stories of a Scattered Family. Now, I'm going to stop talking very, very soon and hand over to Daniel to sort of set the ball rolling. But I just will say a few words about Daniel, if I may. He'll be well known, I think, to many of you. He's a social and cultural historian of great repute, born in London, studied in Cambridge and Cornell University in the States, a lecturer at the University of Sussex, and went on to work at the BBC, where he did produce a wide variety of interesting programs. He's currently a senior research fellow at the Institute of Historical Research, part of the University of London, author of many books, many articles, but most pertinently and most importantly for me, a real kind of, starting point for my own project, a book which is wonderfully readable. Please read it if you haven't, called The Hitler Emigres, The Cultural Impact on Britain of Refugees from Nazism. He was a project consultant to the Insiders Outsiders project from the very beginning, a much valued one, author of the introduction to the companion volume, which focuses on visual culture, and is now a valued trustee of the Insiders Outsiders Arts Foundation, which kind of underpins our activities. So Daniel, a chance to say thank you for your very valued support in all that. Good. So without further ado, let me hand over to Daniel to introduce Kat.
Well, thank you, Monica, for that very kind and generous introduction. It's always a pleasure to work for the project, the Insiders Outsiders project. And I'm very thrilled and very happy and very privileged to be chairing this particular event. The more so because my good friend, Kathy Henderson, I say my good friend, Kathy Henderson, she is a very good friend, and she was a very good friend about 40 years ago when our children went to school together. I don't think we've seen each other very often between then and now, but you haven't changed. The only thing that's really new is this wonderful new book, which I'll introduce in a moment. Kathy is astonishingly versatile. She's had a wonderful career as what? I mean, you try to sum up my background and career, but Kathy's best known, I suppose, for a whole sequence of outstanding children's books that she's written and published, and very often illustrated herself, poetry, collection of songs, a book collection of women's songs, for example. And as I say, she also has a rare capacity to illustrate her writings. And if you have small children, as she and I once did, I can recommend that you get some of Kathy's books. The sheer versatility of her talents and interests, her very engaging style of writing, and as you'll hear in a moment, she's also an extremely engaging, attractive speaker, have won her many, many awards, prizes, and reviews, and so on. But I think it's fair to say, Kathy, you've never before written anything like this latest book that Monica mentioned, My Disappearing Uncle, sounds as though it's by Agatha Christie, colon, Europe, war, and the stories of a scattered family. Who wouldn't want to read a book like that? I'm going to show some pictures as we go, and I'm going to start with the image of the book cover. There it is. And have a good look at the woman on the top left who's got her head slightly on one side, because we'll certainly want to come back to her later on. I'm going to leave Kathy to do most of the talking, so I won't ask you about the disappearing uncle yet, but we'll get back to him later on. What you've done in this extraordinary single volume is, it's not a history book in that it's chronological, based on documents and archive research, although it's got plenty of that in it. It's a very unusual book which incorporates into a single volume everything from a longer term history of, by and large, the Jewish people across much of Central Europe and beyond, to a deeply personal narrative highlighting your own memories, your own ancestry, the family background. And it's based very much not, as I say, just on, in fact, primarily on documents and so on, but it's travel, it's stories, it's people you met who told you about somebody else you hadn't heard of. Tell us, to kick off, Kathy, something about the book. What led you to want to write? I sense you almost needed to write this book. It's brilliantly written, and it's unusually structured, shaped. The data are hard to define at times. We'll hear a lot about that in detail over the next hour. But kick us off, Kathy, and tell us why you felt you wanted to write the book, how you wrote it, and how you would define it if I gave you, 33 seconds to say what the book's about and how you did it.
Is that all?
That's all. So over to you, Kathy.
Easy peasy. No, I mean, basically it's a book that's been creeping up on me for a lifetime. And the center of it are stories, because I'm a sucker for stories. I've always loved stories. I write stories for children. I listen to stories wherever I go. And this was the realization that the stories which I'd grown up with, which took the place of family in many places, had landed on me for some reason. They were all oral stories, and I remembered them, and I thought, okay, I should probably write these down. It won't be too difficult, they're all in my head, and I'm probably the only person who's got as many of them in their head as this, so it's going to be easy peasy. I'll just write them down. Maybe I'll write it for children. So I started with writing the stories down, and then I thought, oh, I wonder. And the moment you start doing that, the moment you lift the edge of the story and you look behind it, well, out roars 200 years of European turmoil. And that's what happened with this. I began with the stories. I thought it might be for children. Then I realized, no, it was actually a much bigger story than that. And I'm very, very interested in how it is that stories shape us, stories make us, turn us into the people we are. So that the core of this book is really my growing up and being a grown up and growing old, and the way in which this stuff goes on rolling and rolling as you go. And all along there are questions, and questions which in some cases I set out to answer. So that's where it started from. And it took about 10 years to write it, but as I say, a lifetime to find it.
But it's very easy to read. It doesn't take very long to read. And I can tell you that because I've now read it twice, and both times I couldn't put it down. I don't want to say there is a kind of intellectual center of gravity to it. I suppose as a boring old-fashioned historian, I noticed that in a sense there is. A great deal of it concentrates on the great days of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, or the Austrian Empire, or the Habsburg Empire, Vienna in particular. And, we follow to places we might think, in some cases, that we know a great deal about, the Vienna of Freud and Mahler and Klimt and Schnitzler and so on. But it also takes us to all sorts of places that I'd never heard of, most of them beginning with K, and we'll come back to that, but not all of them. And they're not all in Austria or wherever. But the Viennese roots, if you like, and in particular, a great deal about the Schindler family and the beautiful, all-important grandma, who was known as Mutti because she was the mummy of your mother, who died, I think, just shortly before you were born, but was known to everybody as Mutti. She must have been quite an exceptional character, beautiful young girl, born in 1887, Anna Schindler, or Annie Schindler. Let's see if we can move on to
well,
another.
let me come in
Go
there.
on, yeah, absolutely.
Because
I just want to show a picture of her, perhaps.
well, you've got her on the screen on the cover of the book. That's her in her dressing room in
Absolutely.
and this
She
is
was the one on the cover. Anyway, tell us about her.
well, this goes back to, as I say, the structure of the book is the structure of my life, my growing up. So these were just figures who were part of the landscape. They were sort of habitat. The image you see on the right now was a photograph that stood on my mother's bedside table. And I was told it was my grandmother, whom I had never met. And I thought, so that's what grandmothers look like. It took me years to work out that she was wearing theatrical costume. She was obviously of the era of Marie Antoinette. If I am 6, she was ancient. And there was this sort of, I don't know, mist of this stuff hanging about. Nobody spent much time talking about it. Nobody spent a lot of time, looking backwards at all. My mother, who was a phenomenal character, also was very determined to get on with the future and so on and so forth. But there was this mist of stuff. And it came from, as you say, Daniel, Vienna. She was born in 1896. By the age of 16, she was her family's breadwinner because her father had died when she was little older than the picture on the left. When she's 7 years old, she was about 8 when her father died. And by 1904, she is working as an actress in the Burg Theater, which is Vienna's principal theater, the Hofburg Palace Theater. And she became a great success as an actress in Vienna at the time, as you say, of Klimt and Schiele and all the artists, writers, musicians. Her cousin Alma was famously to marry Mahler, Gropius, Werfel, and
yes, and a variety of other people.
And a variety of other people. And they had all sort of grown up together. So I don't spend long on her background, but it sort of hovered in the background. And in fact, for the entire rest of my life, whenever, on the rare occasions I meet someone who knew her, the response is always the same. It's of absolute, adoration of this charming, charismatic woman. And she was quite a force to be reckoned with as well. So she's there in the background. It's not a big deal. It's part of the habitat, as I say. And I'm growing up in North London in the 1950s. I'm an English child. I speak English. We don't speak German at home. My mother doesn't speak it. My father comes from Scotland, Ireland, and South America. I'm just an ordinary London child. But there's this stuff hanging in the background. And occasionally stories emerge. So I think one that might be relevant here, Daniel, is the first time I was taken to Austria, aged about 5 or 6, and I took great delight in tobogganing and climbing snowy mountains. And this is the house in which my grandmother lived when she gave birth to my mother. And so we went to stay there for about a week, I think it was. And there I discover, aged about 5 or 6, that my mother was born here. And I'm thinking, this is odd. I didn't know she was born in snow and mountains and so on. And there was the first of the stories, which was that my grandmother, when she went into labor to have my mother, was up this mountain in this house. And it was snowing very heavily in early March. So what does she do? She gets out her toboggan and she toboggans down the mountain to the railway station to catch a train to Innsbruck to have the baby. So, right, okay, fine, I have a tobogganing grandmother. And at 5 or 6, that's quite enough, thank you. And you sort of hang on to it. It's like a bead on a necklace. And that's where these stories begin, little gems like that. So it took a long time in fact, many, many years later, before I wondered what a beautiful actress from the Burgtheater in Vienna was doing on a mountain in
The
1920.
Hügelhof in the Tyrol, in Schwarz.
Yeah, the town is called Schwarz. The house was called the Hügelhof, and it was up the mountain from Schwarz. And so then I look at the history, and then I think, well, what are they doing here? She is this well-known actress, and she has married a man who is a baron by inheritance, Baron Fritz von Schey, and they are living, there they are living on this mountainside. And you'll see here that he's wearing his uniform from the First World War. And indeed, I have a box of his letters wooing her in 1915 from the Galician front of the First World War. Anyways.
So your grandmother is Mutti, mummy, but she's also Frau Baronin.
Yeah, exactly. She has by this time become Frau Baronin, and she's become a mother, so she's genuinely Mutti. Anyway, so you then look at it, and you think, this is the process. You start asking the questions. What are they doing on a mountain? Why are they on a mountain in 1920? Why aren't they still in Vienna? So on and so forth. And then you look at the history, and you get the First World War. You get the aftermath of the First World War, with Austria now reduced to a very, very small country and cut off from all its sources of food supply and other essentials, with all the defeated soldiers coming back from the front, those who aren't dead. And then you get, wait for it, a pandemic. And the pandemic knocks off people right, left, and center, most particularly the young and healthy. So it's quite striking. And it makes absolute sense that these two, with one baby, my mother's older sister, and another on the way, decamp and go and live on a mountaintop. At least there was food, because Vienna was starving. It was absolutely starving. And so you start to get a bit of the background. You start to get a bit of the picture. And
tell me a little bit. I mean, I've at the top of the picture, I've said that he is Fritz, but he's actually Baron Friedrich Schey, Schey, which is why she's a Baronin. Who were the Schey family?
The Schey family, well, his father, Joseph, was a professor of law at Vienna University and wrote the law books of Austria and various other very important things. He was a very modest man. But his father was a kind of Dick Whittington figure who came from Hungary to Vienna at the beginning of the 1800s, in the 1820s, 30s, and made his way there until he became an extremely eminent patron of the arts. He was also a banker to the Habsburgs. He was a founder of factories and railway lines, and he was one of the founders of the Musikverein and the Stadttheater in Vienna. So he was a big cheese, and he built a palace on the Ring when the Ring was built in Vienna in the 1860s. So he's a sort of big classic history book name. His sons all went into money, with the exception of my great-grandfather, who became a lawyer, and a very eminent one. And Fritz, as we call him, because his grandfather was called Friedrich, his name was also Friedrich. He was on the receiving end of all of that, but hadn't really got his own bearings in life, from what I can gather. But anyways, they marry, she becomes Frau Baronin. This is 1915, and it's not until 1919, with the end of the First World War, that titles are abolished. So it's quite important in those days.
It's a lovely picture. And I mean, he's obviously a handsome fellow, but what a beautiful woman his wife, Mutti, was really right throughout her life. I mean, there's a lovely painting of her quite a bit later by your aunt Eliza. This is Annie Schey Koromla, which is the full surname.
See, the fun bit has gone because it's after 1919, so she's shy.
Oh yes, yes.
So she's
Tell
shy.
me, I'll tell you what I want to ask you about now. Much later on, you have a story about the wrong initials, which you can tell us about, which leads you to know a whole lot more about your mother's history, or your grandmother.
Yes, this is much later in the book. But
yes,
first, a quick word about this painting. and the artist. My father was an extremely gifted artist, illustrator, but he was an architect by profession, so he didn't pursue it very much. His sister, on the other hand, went to the Slade and became a very, very talented artist of the mid-20th century in Britain. And she painted these pictures, which are unknown. So that's another interesting side story to all of this.
But I want people to remember your Aunt Eliza, because we will show another picture by her.
Yes, yeah. So anyways, so we have this story, we have the Shires, we have all of that, and we have Mutti and Fritz in their marriage, which does not go as well as might be expected. Or rather, it goes fine until about 1930. They move from those mountains to Munich. They're living in Munich through the great inflation, through the rise of Hitler. They move back to Vienna, and it's the elections for the Nazi Party are just beginning. And Mutti, this powerful woman, is not happy with what is going on in the world. I don't suppose Fritz was either. But meanwhile, he had got involved with somebody else. And the crucial thing about Mutti is that very untypically, I mean, affairs and other relationships in this sort of marriage among the sort of upper bourgeoisie of the ring and so on would have been standard practice, and you just carry on regardless. But she wasn't having it. So she upped and she took her children and left Vienna. She left her husband, she left her homeland, and made tracks, first of all, for Italy, and then to France, and finally arrived in England in 1933. So here's a woman who is a sort of undaunted woman. And I have to say, this book is full of undaunted women. And my contention is, and I think this is quite an important side point, is that the lives of women are much more often told in oral narratives than they are in the history books, which is why these oral stories that I had became so very important to me. Here we have the life of a woman who would otherwise not be known, but it's all told in these various stories. And the same with my mother and her and Mutti's own mother, who also reared her children on her own. So anyways, the marriage comes apart, Mutti leaves, she comes to England, they arrive in England, they go to school here, they become English students, etc., etc. Right, so that the story that Daniel's referring to comes much, much later. I don't really come across it until I am myself a mother of 3 children and, you know, dealing with all the issues of how to make ends meet and all the rest of it. And I start to ask the question, well, hang on, she ups and leaves Vienna. She takes her children. They get divorced, she and Fritz. Fritz marries someone else, another heiress, a shipping heiress from Hamburg. And eventually in 1938 goes to Argentina. So there she is with 3 children, bringing them up. And she manages to cross Europe. She manages to live in Alassio among the artists and the musicians on the down there on the beach, and then in Saint-Paul-de-Vence, again, always surrounded by writers, musicians, artists, actors, dancers. This was the world she moved in. And then she comes to England. And I started to ask, when I was, you know, a middle-aged mother trying to cope with rearing my own children, how did she do it? Hang on a minute, where did the money come from? And this was when I went one day to visit my mother, and she was taking the afternoon off work to clear out her airing cupboard, right? Her linen cupboard, clear out the linen cupboard, right? So we carry all the towels and the sheets and the tablecloths out into the garden in the sun, and we just shake them through and check they haven't got moth and work out which things can go in the bin and so on. And there among the clothes, the cloth, were some very fine damask napkins, which we'd never, ever used. They're much too problematic. And I looked at them and I said, you know, what are this lot? And my mother said, oh, that was Mutti's. It came to me after she died. I said, right, so those are her initials on it, because embroidered on each napkin was a monogram. And the monogram clearly had an A and it had a V, but there was no S. And Annie's maiden name had been Schindler and her married name was Shy. I'm going, well, hang on a minute, how can it be hers if it hasn't got an S on it? What's this other initial? Looks like an L. Oh, says my mother, that was her first husband. She married in 1911 in Vienna. And she married a very important and interesting scientist, I later discovered, called Robert von Lieben, who actually invented the first radio valve. And about a year before the American DeForest patented his, he had patented his own one. And he was fascinating. His mother was Freud's first patient, the one he called his Lehrmeisterin, his teacher. And she was an insomniac, and Freud would turn up and supervise her injection with morphine every day. Nice one. Anyways, she was a Todesco, came from the Todesco Palace. She married von Lieben, who was, I think, head of the stock exchange at the time. And his son, Robert, dropped out of school as being no good at anything and proceeded to become a very, very eminent scientist in a very short time. He was injured in a horse riding accident during his cavalry training after school, and so he couldn't go into the army. Anyways, he becomes this key figure in Vienna, and his laboratory is above what's now known, what is well known in the world as Café Landmann, which is next to the Burgtheater. And it overlooks the stage door of the Burgtheater, where my grandmother was clearly quite an eminence at the time. And somehow or other, they married, well, they fell in love and they married in 1911. And then in 1912, he sold his patents to a big electronic consortium, a mixture of Siemens and what later became Philips, I think. And he got a lot of money for it, but he also took out royalties on these valves that he'd invented. And then in 1913, he dies of leukemia, having been messing around with x-rays and so on, and leaving her heartbroken, childless, and, you know, in Vienna, 1913. And it's only after that she marries my grandfather. And all the evidence is that she was what made that marriage possible, because Fritz was not good with money. And so when they divorced, when she and Fritz divorced, and she upped and took her children and left Austria, not liking what was the writing on the wall in 1931, 1932. It was the original marriage to Robert von Lieben that made it possible, probably made possible our very existence, frankly, because without that, she wouldn't have had the means to be an independent, undaunted, and truly charming woman who kind of picked her way through. She wasn't rich, but she made it work. So that's,
but the story you've just been telling, it also has a complicated lead to somebody who later on becomes a woman who becomes a very famous artist, and also came eventually to this country.
Yes. And that's why this comes up early in the book as partly an anecdote from my childhood. This London childhood had all sorts of things in it, lots of music, lots of art, lots of artists and friends. And we lived in North London, and on weekends we would occasionally walk across the Heath at this to Hampstead and visit people who I later discover are rather eminent artists, people like Milan Kosman and others. Anyways, and one of the houses we would visit was a tall red house in deepest Hampstead, 3-4 stories high. And we would ring at the doorbell and the door would open, and there would be this lovely woman who immediately flung her arms out, hugged my mother, hugged me, spoke German, fine. And we would climb up the inside of this house, up the stairs, up the stairs, up the stairs to the top floor, where her mother was reclining in bed, smoking a pipe, completely bald, and with a whippet curled up on top of her. Yes, it's the other painting we need. This is the person whose mother, the artist who painted this picture of her mother in her last years, was Marie-Louise Motyszycki, who was connected with my grandmother and my mother. Marie-Louise was my mother's godmother, but my grandmother had been married to Henriette, which is the mother here, to her brother. Von Lieben was her brother. And so this connection lasted right the way through into 1950s, 1960s London. And this phenomenal painter, Marie-Louise Motyszycki, who you will have probably run across.
This was one of my favorites, and I hope yours.
Here we are, undaunted women again.
Well, one of the themes of your book, and I'll talk about the general themes later on, but is powerful, independent-minded women, and there are a whole number of them, of whom Mutti is the kind of headquarters in a sense. Let's move the family story on a little bit, because we still haven't mentioned the mysterious disappearing uncle. Here's a photo of after the family have moved to London.
Yes, they grow up here. They spend their teens and so on in Britain. And this picture has my mother in the wedding dress, her older sister to the left with her husband, and in the middle, their younger brother, who he was the youngest of them all. He came to Britain aged 9. And at this point, it's 1940, and he's 16. And this is the wedding photograph, which I rather like.
I think we should tell everybody your mother's name is Inga, because we're going to hear a lot more about her in a moment. There she is in the middle, about to get married.
There she is in the wedding dress with
her young brother Clements, your uncle-to-be, you're not alive yet, in the middle of it. And here is another picture of Clements. I don't know whether you'll recognize it. This is in 1991. And I want to know, Kathy, what happened to him in between the first and the second photos?
Well, I didn't meet him until 1990.
No.
And that's the puzzle of the thing, because from 16, he was a schoolboy. He had been educated here from the age of 9. I think he thought he was a British schoolboy at this point. The fact that he spoke Italian, French, and German was neither here nor there. He knew his background from Austria, but they lived here, and that's what he was. And in 1940, that wedding was April 1940. At the beginning of May, after the collapse of Norway, the British attempt to take Norway to stop the Germans getting to the North Sea, that failed. The Germans occupied Norway. Then the Italians entered into the war on the side of the Axis powers, on the side of Germany. And at this point, one Winston Churchill gets quite fed up, and he issues an edict which is collar the lot, meaning just arrest every bloody foreigner you possibly can and lock them up, because otherwise they'll endanger the country. And the first group of people to be arrested were the people in the coastal counties. Well, at that point in 1940, Clements, we should go back to the other picture, Daniel. The young boy is in fact studying in Vienna, where my mother had been studying too. They both wanted to be doctors, and he was preparing his entry for medical school, as indeed she had been, but she had stopped for 6 months to spend time with her new husband before he was sent off to war. Anyways, so I think it was, I think it's the 8th of May that this edict of collar the lot came out. And the following morning, Clements is interned from the boarding house where he is staying. He is arrested, taken, locked up, shipped from Edinburgh down to Lingfield Racecourse, where they all live sort of underneath the stands. And there he languishes for a bit while they can't find him. His mother was going crazy. She couldn't find out where on earth he was. Anyways, from there, one day, an order comes to pack their little suitcases again. He packed enough for a weekend and get on a train. And so he duly did. I find all this out in 1990, although my father told me a brief version of the story But it was only in 1990 when I met him that I got the full story. My sister recorded it for us. So he's on a train. The train leaves Surrey, which is where Lingfield is, and he knows enough about the British rail system to realise they're heading for London. The train stops on the sidings at Earl's Court. At this point, his mother does not know where he is, and nor do any of the rest of the family. He has got lost. He has been lost. But from the window of the carriage in the train where he's sitting, he can see the kitchen window of his mother's flat in Holland Villas Road. And, you know, at this point, my heart just sort of squeezes, and I think, God, you know, he's under armed guard. The train stops for a couple of hours. There's nothing can be done. Then it moves on up to Liverpool, onto a ship, locked below decks, out into the Atlantic, which at this point is entirely dominated by the U-boats, without a convoy. And they aren't told where they're going. They don't know where they're going. But the long and the short of it is that they end up in Canada. 3 days of train. They end up in a prisoner of war camp in the Arctic Circle. And on that ship across the Atlantic were lots of Nazi prisoners of war. And here's this 16-year-old, thought he was an English schoolboy, young boy of half Jewish parentage, going, oh, I wonder what's going on here. And anyway, it's there, he's locked up until there is a showdown in Parliament in Britain about what's been done to all sorts of people that it shouldn't have been done to, at which point he's released. But the question is what to do. And from there, his decision was to go to South America to join his father, or to at least be in the same country as his father, because his mother, Mutti, was absolutely determined he shouldn't risk his life again crossing the Atlantic. So that's the disappearing uncle. And that's the story I didn't hear till 1990. He was just someone who was far away, and he didn't write letters and didn't answer phone calls and whatever. Just a long, long way away.
The disappearing uncle. Let's go back to your mother, Inga, who looks like a fascinating, talented woman. She loved music. She was a singer. She seems to me, and there she is looking very, very elegant in older age. She lived on until the 1990s. She seems to have embodied something of the old Vienna that she came from. Would that be a fair? Tell us a little bit about your mother, Inga.
I don't think she was at all attached to the old Vienna. She was absolutely instinctively egalitarian, anti-sort of aristocratic kowtowing. I think what Mutti had taken them out of Vienna because she didn't like the tugging of forelocks to the little barons and baronesses. And I think my mother absolutely lived her life on that basis of it's the people you know, and it's not their status and their class and all the rest of it that matters. It's whether they are people you like, whether you get on with them. So in that sense, no nostalgia whatsoever. In fact, she loved Austria. She loved the mountains. She worked a bit at the United Nations in Vienna in later life, but no nostalgia whatsoever. It's all, you know, let's get on with it. And I think that was a remarkable personality trait. It was also a phenomenal thing to grow up with from our point of view. The photograph on the right was taken by my sister on Christmas Eve, which was, of course, an important occasion, which she would always do as wonderful Christmas Eves. And she had wanted to be a singer. In fact, through my early childhood, she was a singer. She later became a very important member of teacher of the Alexander technique and taught musicians, singers, conductors, all sorts of people like, you know, Colin Davis, Charles McKerris, all sorts of people who found her incredibly helpful.
So many of the arts of all kinds in your family history. Let me just move on a little bit to your own childhood and the extraordinary house you were brought up in, which I first thought was probably some kind of a church. You mentioned Christmas. This was a Christmas card from Inga, Bill, your dad, Tessa, your sister, and Catherine on the side there. What an extraordinary building that looks in that particular drawing. What was it actually like being brought up there?
Well, it was a house that looked like a church. And it was in fairly poor condition, I think, when we moved into it. And my parents took the tail end of a lease, which was an insane thing to do. I think it had about 19 years on it. But
where is it?
It's in Highgate, and it's the first house in a road called Broadlands Road. And it was built for a retiring missionary, and it had stained glass in every window. And when we took it on, I think my father would have liked an elegant house more central in London or in Chelsea or something like that. But my mother took one look at the duck shooting punt on trestles across the front door, the beehives in the upstairs bedrooms, and the guns at various windows for knocking off the pigeons that were eating the vegetables, and thought it would be a great place to live. So that's what they did. And they took it on. And we lived there right the way through till till after my mother's death, when it was finally sold. We didn't have the whole of the house because we didn't have that kind of money to keep it up. My father, being an architect, divided it, and we lived in the back, and the front was...
Got a lovely picture of you and your sister Tessa, who's slightly older than you. You're both born just fairly soon after the war, later 40s. And this painting of the two of you, with you on the right and Tessa on the left, by, again, your
Aunt
father's sister, your Aunt Eliza.
Yeah, exactly. Eliza Henderson, K.E. Henderson. She was a fantastic portrait painter and painter in general. And the pity of it is that she's not known at all, for reasons of a tragic end to her life in the 1950s when she committed suicide. And that was heartbreaking for everybody. And so no further mention was made. But I think her work is absolutely extraordinary, and some of it is really, really good. And I hope that at some stage, somebody will decide to do a PhD on her or something, because she's well worth noticing. Anyways, this was
I mean, she did that beautiful painting of Mutti, which we saw earlier on.
Yeah, absolutely.
And doubtless many, many others. Let's sort of begin to put the whole thing together. I don't want to put it together because the whole point of the book is that it isn't an ordered, sculptured book. It's all sorts of different anecdotes, memories that come and go, which between them add up. Seems to me, Kathy, and I'm probably overgeneralizing, there are 2 or 3 major themes that run on and off through the book. One I've already mentioned, and that is the importance of powerful, impressive, independent-minded women, people like Mutti, obviously, your mother Inga, for that matter, and so on. From the point of view of the Insiders Outsiders project, it focuses on the attempts of Jews and others over the course of centuries to move into and then across and ultimately out of and beyond what looked, at least for a while, like potentially safer territories in which to settle. So there's a great deal about Middle Europe as broadly as you want to define it, not just Austria, not just Vienna, and so on. And the third theme, I suppose, would be what we've just been talking about. Again and again, the wider world of culture and the arts. Your narrative includes a wide range of personalities, and we move into and then beyond the Vienna of Freud, Mahler, Klimt. Somebody who knew your grandma Mutti said to you at one point, "I liked Klimt a lot." She was a surviving old lady by the time she told you this. "He wanted to paint me, but my parents wouldn't let me pose for him." Sort of an exciting, artistic, slightly dangerous kind of a world. You talk about going on walks with your mother Inga across Hampstead Heath and, re-meeting Marie-Louise von Matuschiski. Painting, a lot of painting in your own family history and of the world in which so many of them came up. Theatre, of course. Mutti, a superstar actress at the Burg Theater. Alma, so many of the relatives, distant relatives or links to your forebears. Mutti's cousin, Mutti was Anna Schindler, her cousin Alma Schindler, who married Mahler, and who also, as we've already hinted, married or couldn't be bothered to marry the composer Zemlinsky, Kokoschka, the painter, the architect and Bauhaus boss, Walter Gropius, the author, there's a song of Bernadette you might know, Franz Werfel, one way and another, and music. We've just been talking about music. You love music yourself, and your mother was a singer. And so tell us about the great piano that originally I think had been belonging to Mutti, which came across to England, and you played it, but so did a lot of even more celebrated pianists who all wanted to try their hand out on Mutti's piano. Tell us about that.
No, I don't think they were trying their hand. The point was that Mutti had bought this piano for Edwin Fischer, who those of you who know about,
one of the great pianists,
one of the great pianists, and in Berlin in 1932. And it came to London with her. It came to England with her. Ended up in my parents' house in London after her death. And Edwin would come over and play it with people like the Fournier brothers and others, making an orchestra in the living room, you know, and that was part of the sort of legacy. Was that
you mentioned Paul Badura Skoda as another.
Yeah, there's some nice photographs of me with Paul Badura.
Yes,
age about 6. So this is just surrounding habitat. I can't say that it was top of the list of what was talked about, or it was just there. That was how we grew up. And I think as far as the book goes, my central thesis, if you like, is this business about stories, oral narratives. Everybody has them. We all have them. And what do we do with these things? What gets told? What doesn't get told? And why? So when I talk about the disappearing uncle story, what's interesting is that when he finally came in 1990 and told us about it, it was very interesting because the story he told, even though it sort of turns my stomach to think about some parts of it, like the railway sightings, the skies were blue, the sun was shining, and it was all a terrific adventure. And all these stories have this component to them. They are, you know, fun. You know, if you're moving across Europe and living on a beach in Alassio, and then you go to France, and then you end up in Britain, you know, it's entertainment. These are things that are told on car journeys across Europe in the summer holidays. And I started to wonder why it is. Well, first of all, what does and what doesn't get told, because that's very, very significant for everybody. But also, why are they told like this? What is it about them that they should be so sort of optimistic or positive or whatever else? And I realize, or my contention is, that these are in fact courage tales. They are rocket fuel for the next generation. This is what your predecessors, your mother, your grandmother, your whoever else it is did. They managed, they got on with it. They were not victims. They were not survivors. They just made life, and made life well, out of all sorts of odd, you know, making lots of silk purses out of all sorts of odd sow's ears. So I think there's quite a significant point about them that they exist like this, because I think that's what they're designed for. And that's really why I wrote the book. I think it becomes very important to recognize these stories and to recognize the lives of the women who told them and who made them, because they aren't anywhere else in the historical narrative. And the other thing is the extraordinary sequence of accident and coincidence that lies behind these things and raises them. I've told you about the napkin with the initials that opens up the whole thing about science in Vienna in the 1900s. But there was a further one of these. I don't know, do we have time, Daniel? Shall I talk a little about Kosek?
Well, I was going to lead on to that. I think we need to wrap up, but what I want to do before we finish in a moment is just a little few words by way of sum up, and then I'm going to ask you about your recent revisit to all the places I mentioned, or particularly Kosek, beginning with a K. You're Kathy with a K, and you've had an amazing life, Kathy. You've done such a variety of things: reading, writing, drawing, traveling, going here, going there. My favorite photo of all probably is you up a tree. What are you doing? Of course, you're reading. How could you not be? But as you say, you recently, having completed the book, of course, and I read it early on and was happy to review it, but you've recently had reason to revisit Koromla, where the Baron was of, and Kőszeg, which I'd never heard of, primarily officially to do with the reopening of a synagogue that you originally saw the remains of long ago. Tell me about your recent visit to Kőszeg.
Well, I think
start by spelling it.
K-O with an umlaut, S-Z-E-G. And the picture you have just put up is really the key to the last part of the book, the last section of the book. When I was on my way from Austria, where I'd been with family, cousins and so on, at a wedding, to Hungary to visit a friend on Lake Balaton. And I stopped for 10 minutes in this town called Kőszeg because I had been told that this was where the great-great-grandfather who made good in Vienna had come from. And I thought, well, right, I'll have a quick look. 10 minutes should do it, and I'll be on my way. Well, this is no exaggeration, but I have never been caught up in such an extraordinary sequence of coincidences and strange connections as in this town in which I speak none of the language, I know nobody, but one way or another, a sequence of events leads me to, first of all, stay not 10 minutes, but 3 days. And secondly, leads me into a locked and ruined synagogue, which I had just been told had been built by my great-great-great uncle. So this photograph is the photograph I took when I'm standing inside this building, which is locked. Nobody's allowed into it. It's falling into ruin. It's been sold to a property developer to turn it into an Irish pub. It's been abandoned, and somehow by coincidence, I find my way into it. And there, painted on the ceiling, is my mother's family name. And nobody knew about it. I didn't know about it. It was absolutely heart-stopping and one of the most extraordinary experiences I've ever had, and completely unpredictable, and, as I say, coincidence. It seems to me that history is very turbulent and will not lie still. And this was one of those occasions. Anyways, as a result of that, I left this synagogue and I went to make some photocopies of a family tree I had with me to give to the woman who had let me into it, even though it was locked. And I found myself using a photocopier in the university there, which is now called the Institute of Advanced Studies, Kőszeg. And I'm beavering away on the photocopier when in comes a very energetic, busy man with his phone in his hand and so on. And he says, "What are you doing here?" And I go, "I'm using your photocopier. I hope you don't mind." He's obviously the director of the institute. And his student, Jenna, had brought me to use the photocopier. She had been incredibly important in all this story. Anyways, so he said, "Oh, yeah, why are you photocopying?" And I said, "Because I got into the synagogue yesterday." Nobody gets into the synagogue. The synagogue is locked. I got into the synagogue. And then I thought, you know what? I have nothing to lose here. I'm a blooming tourist from London and I don't speak the language. I've got nothing to lose at all. So I turned to him and I said, "I see you're doing cultural heritage management here and you're doing courses on history and all the rest of it. Well, explain to me, please, why this building is left like a bleeding wound in the middle of your town when all the rest of the town is being restored with masses of EU money and you have all these beautiful buildings. Just tell me why. What's the reason? What's the justification for that?" "Yeah," he says, "very bad. It's terrible." And he left the room buzzing away on his phone. Anyways, 10 minutes later, he came back and said, "Come with me. We're having a meeting with the mayor." And so the thing began. And last week, 12 years later, I went back with, I think we were a total of 19 Shai family descendants to a concert to mark the rebirth of this synagogue, which has been brought back and restored. and is absolutely stunning, and it still hits you in the chest when you walk into it. It's very beautiful. And to rename the street from which Philip Schei, who was the man who built this thing, his name had been there. The street had been turned, well, one building in the street became the ghetto in Köseg. The Jews were sent to Auschwitz, and the street was stripped of its name in 1945. And they renamed it. We renamed it last week with his name. So this was an extraordinary series of events, and not something I could ever have predicted, but it was possibly, you know, one of those strange serendipitous things. And Köseg is a very, very lovely town, medieval to Baroque, beautiful little town, about 4 kilometers inside the Hungarian side of the border with Austria, an hour and a half south of Vienna, if ever you are past.
That's a wonderful, wonderful story, Kathy. And you've actually achieved far more than having simply written a book. We'll get on to questions and answers in a minute. Let me remind everybody of the book. It so justifies both its titles. It's about your disappearing uncle, but it is also about Europe, war, and the stories of a very, very scattered family. Thank you so much for writing the book. Thank you so much for being here with us. Brilliant book. I've loved reading it. I may even read it a third time. And thanks for being with us this evening. I'm going to hand back to Monica, and thank you very much, Kathy.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Monica.
Thank you, Daniel, but above all, thank you, Kathy. And I'm sure everyone will agree that we could have gone on listening for many more hours, but I guess we better stop there. And I have to say it was, you know, free-flowing, but also beautifully structured event that we just had the pleasure of listening to. So many, many thanks for that. Now is the chance. It's nearly 7, but I imagine that some people may have some questions or comments they'd like to fire, or at least to direct at Kathy. So now's your chance. I haven't seen, there was a nice comment from, is it John Bennington? Let me just check. Yes, John Bennington, just very complimentary. I bought 10 copies, Kathy, of your remarkable book to give as presents to friends. He's also hoping it might be republished, not only in paperback, but with colour images, which of course would be wonderful. So please either put up a virtual hand or type in anything you might like to contribute. Perhaps I can just chip in with something that struck me, something you said at the very beginning. You said, and I may be misquoting slightly, but you said the story somehow landed on me. And I think this is a really interesting question, which is perhaps another theme that one might add to the ones that Daniel's already outlined. Am I right in suspecting that you are you are obviously the one in your family for whom those stories became pressing and needed to be explored and expressed?
I think it may also be that because I have been a writer of stories and for children and so on, that I mean, I think they matter. I think they matter for children. I think they matter for all of us. But also, my work has also been about oral narrative, oral transmission. And the transmission of history is what's really significant. How do we get the version that we have? And what happens to the lives of women in that transmission process? So I suppose it was all of those things. But I remembered being told them in the back seat of a car, or tobogganing down a hillside, or on a walk across Hampstead Heath. You know, they're entertainment, but they stuck. So I think that's what I suppose I mean by landed. And I'm sure other members of my family have different versions of it. But the one thing I would say is that everybody has these. And the question is, do we value them? Do we keep them? Do we look at why they were told that way? And what is the significance of this for all of us? I do think it matters almost as much as all those beautiful books behind you, Monica, and the ones I live surrounded by, believe it or not, despite this bare wall. Yeah. It's
not just about stories, though. It's also about the silences, isn't it? And the need to prove behind the silences. Now I'm thinking I asked that question partly because I remember a long, long time ago reading a rather, I think, important book by a psychologist called Dina Vardi, actually called Memorial Candles. And one of the main ideas she posits, as I recall, is that in every family, whether you're a writer by professional training or not, there is one for whom it becomes necessary to tell the stories, to probe behind the surface.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. And I found that with other writers, artists I've encountered of the next generations on. And what about your own children? Can I just ask? I mean, have they kind of shared your journey in a sense? Do they take as much interest as you would like them to take?
I think what happens with generations, and this would be true of myself as well, is that while the generation above you is still there, the stories and the narrative is their territory. And you enjoy them, listen to them, but it's not your responsibility or whatever. So it's only, which is why we all have this ghastly thing of when someone dies and you haven't asked that question you should have asked, it breaks your heart. But I think my children have been tolerant and patient about, sitting on a mountainside and my going, we tobogganed down here when I was 4 and your grandmother was born in that house down there. There's a bit of that. And actually my middle son said to me he was very grateful that I had written it all into the book now, because it pulled it together in ways that, I mean, of course, it's only 1/4 of their heritage if you think about grandparents. And there are huge numbers. My father was a big storyteller and he told most of the stories about Mutti, interestingly. He obviously adored her. The storytelling thing zigs and zags, as you say, Monica. There are certain people who fall for it. But I think we all need to offer perhaps more respect to the orally transmitted version of the past.
I'm interested also by what you just said about it being necessary in a almost perverse sense to wait until the person to whom you didn't address the questions has left us in order to feel able and in a strange way liberated to actually look at this.
Tiptoe onto the territory.
Absolutely, it's an odd
and
paradox.
You ask the questions, and that's where all the history research came into this book.
Amanda, we were talking about you, Amanda Hopkinson. Did you want to say something? You don't actually have a hand up, but you unmuted.
That's all right, Kathy. It's a sort of what you've just said makes me think that sometime soon there's going to need to be a storyteller of all the stories that make up all our stories, because we all discover them, as you said, almost too late in life, when the people that could have given us first-hand accounts have left. And I note from what you're saying again and again, the resonances with the coincidences that I've also experienced, and so have other people, right down to the fact that, yes, I found the old synagogue in Olomouc in Moravia, which was where a family I never knew about had lived, which was part of my family, and grew up, and then discovered that they were also the main donors and rehabilitators of the synagogue afterwards. So we all have stories that seem to intersect all the time. But also a short part of our shared stories that I lived in your house with you, of course, when I was 5, and we started school together, over to Channing. And I've just got a couple of memories of the house, which, yes, did look like a church. I think it was when your parents separated that your mother moved into the back. There was still a lot of moving around that was going on. It was a very sort of upheaved vision. But the garden, of course, stayed the same. And the two absolutely astounding things about the garden were that, one, it had hens in it and muscovy ducks. And the other thing was the bloody muscovy ducks kept escaping and getting into the swimming pool, which, of course, in good sort of Austrian fresh air, countryside liberation kind of feeling, was outside and completely unheated. And it was then a chore to somebody had to get into the blooming swimming pool, fish out the muscovy ducks before they shat everywhere. So that was unusual, to say the least.
Footnote on the swimming pool was that it was actually a crater created by a First World War bomb, and the previous owners had simply concreted it out and put a bath plug at the bottom. And that became the great entertainment of our lives. We nearly froze to death in it. It was excellent. Excellent.
Yes, yes. And Paul Badura Skoda was another fantastic entertainer. And the way he got us sitting at the piano on his lap, this Hungarian pianist, and sort of...
No, Viennese. He wasn't Hungarian. Yeah.
I thought it was Hungarian origin. Anyway, he would sit us there and he would make up stories about the keyboard. So little E goes on the walk and gets lost. So you now have to play the tune without an E in it. What do you do? And so you became fascinated by as another story. Not just, you know, oh God, have I got to learn the piano as well now? I'm not coping too well at school as it is, or whatever. No, I mean, it's a place absolutely rich in memories. And the one other musical one, very briefly, I wanted to add was that there was a plate, a bronze plate, I guess, on the gatepost that said, now you have to correct me if I'm wrong then, W.A. Henderson, architect. And of course, I never realized that the man I knew as Bill at the age of 5 could be called William, because B and W didn't, you know, it wasn't obvious it was a shortened name. And I asked him what the W.A. was for, and he said Wolfgang Amadeus. So when I went to school and I was asked at some stage, I don't think it was when I was 5, but probably later on in primary school, where I was living, and did that, for some reason, did the house have a name? And I said, yes, that's right, Wolfgang Amadeus Henderson's house. And so they put this down, apparently, that I was living there.
I didn't know that story. That's a good one.
Lovely. The memories are obviously still vivid. I should just perhaps on the back of what Amanda said, I mean, yes, there are obviously intersecting threads, you know, in all these extraordinary stories, and yet each one, I mean, I'm struck by this all the time, each one is utterly unique at the same time, isn't it?
Yeah.
As indeed your book proves, amply proves. Does anybody else want to say anything? If not, I guess we should begin to wind things up. Last chance? No? Okay. Let me just say a few things of a practical.
We've got a hand waving over there.
And have we? Sorry, I've managed to miss it. Who is it? Yes. Hi, Marjorie. Go ahead.
Quickly, Veronica, no question, but just to say what wonderful talks you have on this Insiders, Outsiders. Absolutely wonderful.
Well, again, they're all different, and yet with so many things.
So different, but so interesting. And with you, you know the sort of work that I do, and I very much link in with what Catherine is saying here about researching and finding all these links within links, etc. Fascinating. Thank you.
And thank you, Marjorie. I should add that Marjorie gave a lovely talk about the Emigre Educators, Camp Hill,
yes.
et cetera, which is on the Insiders Outsiders YouTube channel, which I was going to mention again, because first of all, this talk, as you may have noticed, has been recorded. So for those of you who'd like to listen again, tell your friends, etc., those signed up didn't make it tonight, it will be available in a few days' time on the channel. But we do also again talk about interesting intersections. There's a talk by somebody called Ines Schlenker on Milan Kosman. We have a whole subsection on internment, Kathy, which might interest you, because clearly that's been of great interest and relevance to the general topic of Insiders Outsiders. So a whole wealth of material on the internment, the shameful, morally murky, to say the least, internment episode, including one specifically on Canada, by the way. As for the wonderful Marie-Louise von Motyszycki, who I remember meeting in her very old age back in the early part of my career, wonderful, inspirational person. There's going to be an exhibition of her work at Berg House, the Hampstead Museum, next year in May, I think, onwards, so look out for that. And so on and so forth. I think that's probably all I need to say, except that for those of you who haven't read Kathy's fabulous book, we've managed to persuade the publishers to offer a 50% discount on it, and free postage and packing in this country. And what I'll do as soon as we've logged off, which will be in a minute, I'll actually send a message to everybody who signed up to give them the details of how to secure the discount. So once again, thank you so much. That was really, really wonderfully.
Thank you, Monica. Totally it's been great. Thank you, Daniel.
And thank you, everyone, for listening in, and all the very best. Hope to see you again. Actually, I should just add there's another talk on Thursday of a very different nature. It won't appeal to everybody here, but in case you don't know about it, it's by an art historian called Alexandra Lazar, about a very interesting and I think unjustifiably neglected town planner and teacher of architectural and sort of town planning sort of ideas, called Arthur Korn, born in Germany, but who came to this country in the 30s. So if you're interested, check out the insidersoutsiders.org website and you will find out more. Good. All right. All the very best and have a good evening.
Thank
Thanks
you.
a lot.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Night.